You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 364, the New England Tour, and North Carolina joins the Union. We recently covered the first session of Congress in 1789, where they did all sorts of things like recommend the Bill of Rights for ratification, passed a Judiciary Act to create the court system, created all the executive departments, and a host of other things to get the country off to a good start. At the end of September, the members of Congress left New York and went home for the rest of the year. Washington remained in New York, continuing to work on the establishment of a whole host of government functions. Once Congress left, though, Washington began planning to get out of New York himself, at least for a little while. He didn't plan to go home. Instead, he planned a trip to New England. The president had actually been rather ill for several months during the congressional session. Back in June, he was suffering from what he called a tumor on his left thigh. Now, the word tumor today is largely associated with cancer. That was not the case with this situation. This was a big swollen lump, likely caused by some sort of infection. That said, any such malady in the 18th century could easily have been fatal. Washington developed a high fever. A witness described the tumor as the size of 2 fists. In June, Washington and his doctors decided surgery was required. Again, in the 18th century, before germs and infection were really understood, any surgery carried with it a risk of death as well. On June 17th, Dr. Samuel Bard was called to the president's residence to operate. The doctor cut out the tumor without any anesthesia. Washington remained awake and conscious through the procedure. Following the surgery, the president was bedridden for about 6 weeks, unable even to sit up for quite some time. The illness and procedure had largely been kept quiet. Washington remained in his home, not receiving visitors, so rumors obviously began to fly. Crowds began to grow around his residence as locals grew concerned about the president's health. Officials blocked traffic in front of the presidential residence so that he would not be disturbed by the noise. During this time, we can read panicked letters by members of Congress, including James Madison, who feared that if the president died an untimely death at this critical time, it could derail the entire federal government. They saw Washington's leadership as that critical to the success of the United States. By mid-August, Washington was able to begin corresponding again. He wrote to several friends and family that he had recovered from the surgery. He even made 2 personal appearances in the Senate that month. But the recovery was slow and painful. It was not until September that Washington wrote his physician in Virginia that he could report most of the pain was gone. Now, perhaps one reason for his decision to ride around New England in the fall was to dispel rumors about his health. It may also have been that Washington felt better when he was out riding, not cooped up in a city house. Beyond any personal issues, though, Washington wanted to connect with the people who he was responsible for governing. Aside from all the legislation, one of the most important things Washington needed to do was make sure the State of the Union was strong. For many Americans, Washington was the personification of the Union. Washington also wanted to know what the people were thinking. He wanted to get out of the Capitol and talk to regular people. He wanted to see for himself how the country was doing and what was on the people's minds. Washington had already spent a great deal of time in the Mid-Atlantic during the war, and had also stopped in many towns in his various trips from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia and New York after the war. He really hadn't spent much time in New England, though. In fact, he hadn't been there since the Siege of Boston back in 1776. Washington thought he could rectify this by taking a tour of New England during the congressional recess. So after Congress went home at the end of September, Washington made plans for his trip. He invited Vice President John Adams to join him. Adams knew his native New England pretty well, and he would be headed to his home near Boston anyway. Washington and Adams had never been particularly close. They'd never really mixed socially. Sometimes they were on the same side of a political issue, sometimes not. When the two were selected to lead the new federal government, Washington had reached out to the vice president to get some advice on various matters, and he wasn't really impressed with the response. So the two men had largely operated separately during this early period of their administration. Now, there are many reasons why Washington might have invited Adams. Washington might have thought it proper courtesy to invite the leading New England politician. It might also have been an opportunity for the two men to get to know each other during the trip, but any of this is really just speculation since Washington never articulated his thoughts on the matter. We also don't know how the two might have interacted during the trip since Adams declined the offer. The vice president left for home several days before Washington left New York. Washington began his trip on October 15th. An honor guard, including John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, escorted him to the Connecticut state line. But Washington made the trip on his own. His only companions were his two personal secretaries, Major William Jackson and Tobias Lear. 6 personal slaves also came with them to take care of the coach and horses and the various servant duties that were necessary. Washington hoped to keep the pomp and circumstance to a minimum, which is probably why he traveled with such a small party. His diary made careful note of the farms he passed, noting that Connecticut had, quote, few or no opulent men and no poor. As he approached each town, he would stop his coach, mount his white horse, and make a grand entry. There would inevitably be some celebrations at each stop. Local officials would want to toast the president and host dinners. Washington tried to use this time to understand the locals better and get to know the local concerns. He was also particularly interested in the budding textile and manufacturing industries. The president understood that American independence required economic independence. Most people still imported suits or at least finished cloth and other items from Britain. Washington had worn a suit of homespun cloth to his inaugural, hoping to encourage this fashion. Beyond textile, Washington was interested in the establishment of factories that were producing things like glass, shoes, and furniture, and New England was the heart of this for the nation. Washington had also determined not to stay in any private homes during his trip. He stuck to taverns and public houses. This was probably to avoid insulting anyone by choosing to stay in one person's home over another. It may have also been an attempt to avoid granting any appearance of favor to any person. The party spent its first night in Fairfield, Connecticut, then heading to New Haven the following day. The Connecticut legislature arranged for a greeting committee to escort him into the town of Fairfield, but they apparently missed him as his coach slipped by, and Washington rode into town without the escort. A few days later, the president entered Hartford. There he toured a wool mill, which Congressman Jeremiah Wadsworth was a partner. Washington spoke directly with the mill workers and asked lots of questions. He spoke highly of the work they were doing, although he noted in his diary that he did not think cloth was of the finest quality. He also noted that a great many women and girls were working in these mills, and he viewed that as a positive. One of the problems with manufacturing and industry is that it was a concern that there would not be enough people doing agriculture to make enough food. So women and girls who were not as actively involved in the agriculture could go off and work in factories while the men farmed their fields. At least that's how they looked at it at the time. After about a week in Connecticut, Washington rode into western Massachusetts. He did not want to travel and leave Connecticut through the east because that would have caused him to pass through Rhode Island. Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution, so Washington consciously avoided going through the state. He wanted to stay in the United States, and Rhode Island was not a part of that. So instead, he headed for Springfield, Massachusetts, and then made his way east through the state of Massachusetts, arriving in Worcester on October 23rd. As he traveled through western Massachusetts, an express rider from Governor John Hancock informed him that the governor was making plans for the president's arrival and invited him to stay at his home. Washington, of course, graciously rejected the offer, telling Hancock that he had determined not to accept any private offers for lodging and that he had already made plans for lodging in Boston. Hancock then responded that he hoped Washington would at least join him for a dinner at his home and inquired when Washington expected to reach Boston. There followed a series of notes that touched off a protocol dispute. Governor Hancock expected Washington to call on the governor, as a foreign ambassador might when coming to the state. Washington, however, believing the presidency superior to a state governor, believed that Hancock should call on him when the president arrived in Boston. As the president's coach approached Boston, he was greeted by a military parade of about 800 men at Cambridge. Hancock noted that the soldiers would meet him on the same ground where he had been received in 1775 when he first took command of the Continental Army. Washington tried to object. He was not really comfortable with this either. He was expected to review the troops, but he was a civilian leader at this point. He was not their commander, and he felt uncomfortable reviewing men under arms. But at the risk of snubbing the militia, Washington relented and went along with it. Things got worse, though, when Washington tried to enter Boston proper. The Governor's Council, led by Lieutenant Governor Samuel Adams, met Washington at Cambridge to escort him into the city. As this group tried to cross Boston Neck, the members of the Boston Town Committee blocked the path. The town leaders demanded that they, and not state officials, control the events to host the president in town. This standoff lasted for over an hour, as Washington grew more impatient while everyone stood out in the cold and rain. Finally, the Governor's Council gave in and permitted town officials to take the lead. Washington finally made it to the home he had rented, which was about a block from Governor Hancock. Washington then awaited the governor's arrival. Instead, he received a note from Hancock asking Washington to join him at his home. Washington refused, and there ended up being a standoff. Washington simply had a simple dinner with Lieutenant Governor Samuel Adams, while Hancock remained at his residence with a large party who was expecting Washington's arrival. The following morning, Hancock tried to excuse his failure to call on the president, claiming that he had been struck by a severe case of gout. Washington really didn't buy the excuse since Hancock had been holding a huge party at his house the night before. Washington remained firm, essentially saying he'd love to receive the governor, but if Hancock was too sick, he would understand, and they could do this some other time. Hancock got the hint and finally showed up at Washington's rented home. Perhaps to underscore his excuse that he had a bad case of gout, he was carried by two servants and had his legs wrapped in red flannel. Washington spent nearly a week in Boston, enjoying a parade in his honor, as well as multiple banquets, toasts, and other celebrations. The whole city turned out to greet the president, although several articles did note the absence of John Adams at the parade and other events. The vice president remained in his nearby home in Braintree. Washington's participation in events resulted in him coming down with a cold. He ended up canceling a trip to Lexington so that he could recover. In fact, there was cold and flu going all up and down the East Coast. Some members of Washington's family who he had left back in New York were also sick at this time. The illness that everyone was catching became known as the President's Flu. After leaving Boston, Washington traveled north to Salem. Along the way, he made several stops. He went to Lynn, Massachusetts to inspect a shoe factory, and he also went to Marblehead to hold a reunion with General John Glover. Washington noted that Marblehead had fallen on hard times. The fishing industry never really bounced back after the war. Nearly a quarter of the population consisted of widows and orphans. The town looked dirty and destitute, and this actually had an impact on the president. Many of the people noted that he seemed saddened when he entered Salem later that day. When Washington reached the New Hampshire border, he was met by New Hampshire Governor John Langdon, who personally escorted him to Portsmouth. There would be no dispute over who would call on who in New Hampshire. Again, the city of Portsmouth, like the other cities, hosted the president with banquets and parades. There, Washington also caught up with his old general, John Sullivan. Washington's former general had just completed 3 years as state governor and had received an appointment from Washington to become the first federal judge in New Hampshire. Washington then crossed over the harbor to visit a fort in Maine. At the time, this was still part of Massachusetts, and this was the northernmost visit of his trip. He also paid a call on the wife of former colonial governor Benning Wentworth, and also accompanied his secretary Tobias Lear on a visit to see Lear's mother. Washington also spent one afternoon in Portsmouth sitting for a portrait. By the time Washington was ready to leave Portsmouth, it was already early November. There was apparently some consideration given to visiting Vermont. Washington ended up declining this option. Part of the reason seems to have been that snow was beginning to fall, and they were worried about a trip into the inland areas and how much difficult it might be to get back. There was also the concern that Vermont was not really part of the Union, and its status was very questionable. Vermont very much wanted to join the Union, but New York still considered Vermont to be part of New York. Washington may have been concerned that his visit might open up disputes from New York, which still claimed Vermont, and Washington didn't want to get into that political mess. So instead, Washington headed for home. His diary notes complaints of poor and crooked roads, as well as receiving poor directions from the locals. He also complained about having to comply with the New England custom of not traveling on a Sunday. So on Sunday, the president had to stop for the entire day, which he spent attending 2 local services at different churches. It took about a week and a half to get back to New York City. Now, unlike the trip north, the return trip consisted of long rides each day, beginning often before dawn. He avoided major towns and certainly didn't want to return through Boston. He made no attempt to announce his arrival when he rode through a town, so many small towns were caught unaware as the president rode through. One minister in Milford, Massachusetts, recalled that he was out shoveling manure when someone called out that the president was passing by. The minister quickly dropped what he was doing, washed and changed so that he could rush down to the local tavern and meet the president. Washington arrived back in New York on November 13th, returning to the presidential mansion and reuniting with Martha. His entire trip took less than a month, and he had recorded visits in 60 towns and villages. Overall, the trip was considered a success. Washington had been celebrated wherever he went, and people seemed ready to give the new federal government a chance and appreciated the visit from their leader. Shortly after his return to New York, Washington received good news from the South. North Carolina and Rhode Island were the only 2 states who refused to ratify the Constitution. They had been watching the new nation move along without them. North Carolina Governor Samuel Johnston had sent his congratulations to Washington when the president was inaugurated. At the time, the governor expressed his hope that North Carolina would join the Union as soon as certain amendments were proposed. Congress, of course, proposed a Bill of Rights in September and sent those off to the states for ratification. In November, North Carolina delegates met a second time for a constitutional convention. This second convention began in Fayetteville on November 16th. Now, while there was still some opposition, the mood had changed radically since the first convention refused to ratify the Constitution back in August of 1788. The United States was moving forward without them, and a Bill of Rights, which had been a major objection at the first convention, was well on its way to being ratified. Also, Congress had implemented trade tariffs on anyone importing goods into the U.S. Since Rhode Island and North Carolina were considered foreign states at this time, the tariffs would have greatly damaged trade and cost North Carolina merchants. After North Carolina petitioned Congress on this issue, Congress agreed to suspend the tariffs until January 15, 1790. So state officials knew that the tariff would go into effect if they failed to ratify in 1789. These changed circumstances meant that there was a great deal more support for ratification, and everyone pretty much knew it was going to pass in this second attempt. Some of the leading opponents did not even bother to run as delegates to the new convention. A great many of those who voted no at the first convention were ready to vote yes this second time. On their first day, Monday, November 15th, the convention chose Governor Samuel Johnston as president of the convention. They did so even though Johnson was sick and not in attendance. They also voted for State Senator Charles Johnson to be vice president, so Charles Johnson took charge of the convention in the governor's absence. The following day, they prepared and adopted rules for the convention. On Wednesday, the convention met in a committee of the whole to consider the Constitution. The delegates called for copies of the proposed Bill of Rights that had been passed by Congress to be printed and circulated among the delegates so they could discuss them. By Friday, Governor Johnston had made it to the convention and took charge. The Committee of the Whole had already agreed to ratify the Constitution, so on Saturday the delegates moved to take up that report and agree to ratify the Constitution. There was still some objection from an opposition. James Galloway proposed that North Carolina only ratify conditionally. He still wanted Congress to address 5 amendments that North Carolina had demanded in its first convention but were not addressed by the Bill of Rights. But as I said, the mood in North Carolina had turned. The majority wanted to get into the Union, and they could work out whatever details concerned them at a later time. The convention rejected Galloway's proposal and voted overwhelmingly, 194 to 77, to agree to an unconditional ratification of the Constitution. The convention concluded its work on Monday. Following the convention, Governor Johnston transmitted the results to President Washington on December 4th, making North Carolina the 12th state to join the Union. Washington then informed Congress when it returned to session in January of 1790. Now, even before Congress officially received the news in January, the North Carolina General Assembly voted to ratify the Bill of Rights on December 22nd. It was the 3rd state to do so, behind only New Jersey and Maryland. By the end of January, more states, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Delaware, would also ratify the Bill of Rights. Next week, Washington gives his first State of the Union address to Congress. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, and 10 Crucial Days. I also want to welcome Gregory Beckett and John Katalinich, who joined at the standard bearer level. Everyone who supports this podcast at the $10 level or higher will receive a new magnet each month with a different flag from the Revolutionary War. And remember, if you join on Patreon, even at the $2 level, you get access to commercial-free episodes and other great things. I really do appreciate everyone who supports this podcast. Keeping this whole project financially viable is what allows me to continue to make more episodes. I've been trying to increase the content through my Revolution 250 episodes and other special episodes during the week. I hope you guys appreciate it, and if you do, I would really appreciate your financial support. I also want to thank Theo Speedy for a one-time gift via PayPal. As I said, I appreciate both ongoing subscriptions on Patreon and one-time gifts. I also want to mention that I'm heading to South Carolina in November of 2025. I'm going down for the Congress of American Revolution Roundtables, which is taking place in Camden, so I'm going to spend a few days there, but I'm also going to spend a few days in Charleston, visiting some of the historical sites there. If anyone wants to have a meetup in the area, just let me know. Now, this week, we covered George Washington's first presidential tour. Over the next couple of years, he will also take a tour of Long Island, another one of the southern states. Washington's tours are largely forgotten today, but they were really big deals at the time. People from everywhere were excited to meet the man who had won American independence and who was serving as the nation's first leader under the new Constitution. I didn't get into all the details about the fuss made over Washington during his visits. Some towns went crazy. They built huge triumphal arches for him to ride under. Some had choirs singing songs that were written in his honor. They did a bunch of boating events, all sorts of great things. I did mention the parades and fireworks that followed him almost everywhere, but these really were massive events. People came from all over the region, so that crowds in attendance at these parades were often larger than the population of the town he was visiting. Banquets, followed by endless toasts, seemed required almost every night. Now, Washington had hoped to avoid the pageantry that would make him appear like a king, something he really actively fought against during his entire administration. He dressed plainly and tried to discourage elaborate ceremonies, although he usually went along with whatever was planned for him, mostly not to appear rude to his hosts. He would usually make a reply to a public welcoming statement that was directed at him, but these were usually fairly short thank yous. He was also expected to say a few words at each banquet. He was always very methodical, and he would have his secretaries draft statements for him ahead of time anytime he needed to speak. But he wanted to keep his statements short. He was not looking to make long speeches, but rather simply wanted to thank people for the kindness that they showed him. To the extent he said anything of substance, it usually focused on the need for a strong federal union and the need for economic self-sufficiency. Local militia, in uniform and ready for inspection, were a near universal presence in each town that he visited. Again, Washington was not comfortable appearing as a military leader, but he accepted the need to appear gracious. He did object when Governor Hancock expressed a desire to have a military escort take him through his entire ride through the state of Massachusetts. Entering each town surrounded by a military escort was exactly the type of pageantry that Washington hoped to avoid. Now, I also mentioned that Washington left Martha in New York during this trip. The journey was a pretty demanding one, with very early mornings. He often set off before dawn, often trying to avoid the military escorts and parades of praise that he would get otherwise. He had very long days on the road most of the time. Martha at this time was caring for their 2 grandchildren, and he didn't want to put them through all these rigors. Whatever the rigors of being on the road, Washington did seem to enjoy the tours. He traveled to Rhode Island after it joined the Union. He took a trip to Long Island, and then finally his southern tour in 1791. He did not take tours during his second term. He made sure to visit all the states during his first term, and that was it. He was done. There may have been various reasons for this, but he wanted to visit at least every state once, and he was probably concerned that if you visit some states multiple times, that would cause an issue for those who did not get that second visit. My book recommendation this week is George Washington's Journey by T.H. Breen. It covers the trips that Washington made while president, and it focuses on his interest in economic development. The book is about 200 pages, not counting notes and index. The author, Breen, is a history professor who's taught at multiple schools. If you want a book that focuses on Washington's presidential tours, get George Washington's Journey by T.H. Breen. My online recommendation is a public domain book called The Diary of George Washington from 1789 to 1791. This is pretty much what it sounds like. It is George Washington's personal diary. It covers Washington's personal thoughts, although the entries are clearly written in a way that he knew that this would be made public someday. It covers the early years of his presidency, including these tours. Washington's various diaries were scattered after his death, and some, including the ones for these years, were in private hands. This book published Washington's entries, as I said, from 1789 to 1791. The book was first published in 1861. As it's in the public domain, it is available to read online or download from archive.org. So, if you're looking for the best primary account of all of Washington's tour from the man himself, this is what you want. My question this week asks, who is John Hanson and why do some people call him our first president? This story relates to the fact that in the Continental Congress, the presiding officer in Congress held the title of President of the United States in Congress Assembled. So technically Hanson used that title before George Washington did. Now, the reason why it's really a technicality is that even though the title was used before the Constitution was adopted, the office of President under the Articles of Confederation was a completely different job. It's probably most similar to the Speaker of the House or even the parliamentarian in the House. The president, under the Articles, had no executive authority. He simply kept order in the Continental Congress and called on speakers during debate. He also usually handled correspondence on behalf of Congress. The other big problem with the claim that Hanson is our first president is that even though Hanson held that office, he was not the first one to do so. The first presiding officer was Peyton Randolph, although he held that position before there was a United States. That was still when they were in the colonies. The presiding officer when the colonies became the United States was John Hancock. Now, it's not clear if Hancock or his successors used the specific title of President of the United States, and many people simply refer to them as the President of Congress. The specific title of President of the United States was introduced in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were first introduced in 1777, but not ratified until 1781. Congress operated under some of its provisions and likely used the term President of the United States during the period after it was introduced but before it was ratified. But even if you want to restrict this title until it became official after ratification of the Articles was complete, Samuel Huntington was president when the Articles were ratified. And after he left office, Thomas McKean served for quite some time as the interim president. It was only after McKean stepped down that John Hanson became president. So, what's so special about John Hanson? He was a Maryland politician who supported the Patriot cause, mostly at the state level, until his appointment to the Second Continental Congress in late 1779. His fellow delegates selected him to serve a one-year term as president in November 1781. At the time, nobody else really wanted the job. McKean wanted to resign after the victory at Yorktown, and his fellow delegates had to pressure him to stick around until November, when the new session of Congress began. That was when Hanson got the job. So why is Hanson considered first? In 1898, a descendant of Hanson's, a guy named Douglas H. Thomas, wrote a biography and made this claim about his ancestor. I think the claim had more to selling books or seeking family notoriety than anything else, and there were a lot of caveats in the claim. Hanson was the first person elected to a full term after ratification of the Articles. The qualifier of election to a full term knocked out Huntington, who was elected before ratification, and McKean, who did not serve one full term. There were a total of 10 presidents, including Huntington and McKean, who served under the Articles of Confederation. There were 2 other men who served as President of the United States before the Articles were ratified, and another 2 who served as president during the colonial era. So that's the story. Hanson was the first elected president to a full term under the Articles of Confederation. But if you're ever in a trivia contest who just asks for the first president under the Articles I would say the answer is Samuel Huntington. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.